Today I want to do something a little bit different. Rather than showing you how to edit photographs, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cameras I've owned, because over the last 10 years I've owned and sold a lot of cameras. Now this isn't a gear review, it's actually more to do with software and how I think I've been tricked into changing the cameras I own far too often. If we look at the image on screen, what I've got here is a Sony NEX5. I bought this when the camera first came out, and I'll be honest, I wasn't really blown away with the lenses on there. They had a lot of distortion, so you tend to get barrel distortion where the centre of the image tends to sort of protrude out, and also around the edges of the frame. It was soft, there was no real detail there. So if I take this image and I zoom into 100%, and I'll just take it over and look in the corners, and this area here and this area here look a little bit soft, and when I go out to the edges here of the frame, it's also soft. Now I'm not sure how well this is going to translate into a video, but I'm going to zoom in to 200% so you can see what I mean. The rock just isn't sharp, and the grass here certainly isn't sharp. Now I know lenses aren't going to be perfect, but I do expect better performance than this. And if I look at the edges out here, you can see that the quality's just gone off completely. But in the centre, it's quite sharp. It's not a bad performance at all. But edges and corners of the frame are terrible. This image was processed with the default settings in the latest version of Lightroom. And I have to admit, if I look back to the earlier versions of Lightroom, probably 10 years ago, what you would find is that the image quality was worse than it is now. So they've definitely made some improvements. The problem is, the image quality isn't as good as it could be. Let me show you now an image processed in Photolab 2. And again, this is just using the defaults. So if I turn this layer on, you can immediately see much more detail here in the centre of the frame. Now let's come down to the corners, and not perfect, but it's a lot better. Compare the Photolab version with the Lightroom version, and you can see there's distortion there that there isn't in the Photolab. And also it's made the image go soft where the edges of the frame are being stretched. Let's look at the top corner now, and actually it's not looking too bad. Remember, we're at 200% magnification. In the Lightroom version you can see that we've got softness here, and I would actually say that the quality of that is verging on what I wouldn't accept. If I look at the Photolab version, the quality is much better. Both of these images were processed with the default settings from a raw file. And what I'm finding is that the new version of Photolab is performing much better than the Adobe versions, especially when it comes to doing just standard lens correction. I actually think that the poor performance, especially into the corners, with some of the cameras I've owned, has actually caused me to sell these cameras needlessly when I shouldn't have. Let's have a look at a couple more examples. We'll go to the Sony RX10 just to show you that these problems exist whether you're at the long end, the medium, or at the wide end of the focal lengths. I've got an image here that was shot with probably the Sony RX10 at its extreme, 200mm. I almost sold this camera because the lens performance was very poor around the edges, and especially one edge in particular. I did end up having the camera repaired because there was some mould got into the lens. I don't know how, considering it was supposed to be a sealed unit. Once I'd had it repaired, actually the edges performed quite well. The image I'm seeing on screen now was actually one I shot with the lens before it was repaired. So if I go into 100%, and what we can see in the Lightroom version is quite a bit of detail. It looks quite good. I'm almost seeing the network of fencing that's around here on the image. If I scroll down to the bottom though, you can see that there is softening of the lens here coming in, and especially as you get down to the edge. Let's have a look now at the Photolab version. It's still showing some softness down here, but nowhere near the same amount. If we come up to here, you can actually start to see there is a faint fencing here. I'll show you if I zoom in. So here we are at 200%, and you can actually see the mesh on the fencing. If we turn that off, it's just about there in the Adobe version. Let's look at the other side of the frame, which isn't too bad, and I can see lots of details here. You can see the lightning rod and the cabling down the tower, and if I turn that off, actually the Adobe version's not too bad. So what's happening here? Well, I think what we're seeing is poor lens correction. If I look at the Photolab version, it's definitely better, and I think it's correcting the distortion a lot better than the Lightroom profiles do. One of the things that actually made me first realise about this problem was getting some photos I'd submitted to a photo library rejected because of lens softness, especially into the corners. But this doesn't seem to happen with all the cameras. Certainly the Canon cameras I've owned, the lens corrections within Lightroom, they are quite extreme, but they seem to perform much better. Nikon isn't bad either, but when you go to things like Sony, they just don't perform as well. And the Photolab version is definitely better. Let's have another look now, but we'll look at a standard image. So this is equivalent of about 50mm in the Sony RX10. So if I zoom into 100%, you can see plenty of detail with the RX10. You can see a lot of fine detail here in the arches. If I move down to the bottom though, it's starting to go soft again at the edges. So let's just zoom in a little bit further. And you can see there isn't a huge amount of detail. It's there, but it's just soft. Let's compare that now with Photolab. And immediately you can see all the detail that was missing from these steps is there. And you can also see there's a difference in lens correction. Let's have a look at the details above as well. So now you're seeing lots of very fine detail in the stonework. With the Adobe version, it's just soft. So there really is a huge amount of difference that some of these RAW converters are making when they convert our files. And we seem to accept that whatever we get is what the camera saw. And actually, it's probably not. The software is making a big difference. In my case, it was making enough of a difference to have me sell some cameras. Fortunately, the RX10 isn't one that I sold in the end. I've hung on to it. And what I'm finding is when I'm using the Photolab converter with it, the performance of the lens is a lot better. Now let's have a look what happens at the wide end. So here is an image shot at the 24mm end of the RX10. You can actually see that in the corners there's a bit of vignetting. Don't worry about that, that's because I had a protector on because this was very stormy weather and I was trying to shoot in the rain. Let's zoom in now at 100% and we can see a lot of sharpness around the lettering and it actually looks quite clear. If we go out to the corners, it's starting to look a little soft here. So let's zoom into 200% and you can see it is soft. We say the same problem over on this side as well. So let's have a look at what Photolab did with it. Well, actually, it's a lot clearer. You still can't read the writing, but remember this is the outside edge of a wide angle zoom. So that actually is a very good performance. And over on the other side, we see this man a little bit clearer. And if we look at the central area in the writing, it's a huge amount of difference between the two. Now, this isn't just down to sharpening, this is down to the way that the image is being processed by the RAW converter and that it's removing lens distortion. I'm going to show you now a really extreme example, which was shot with a Sony RX100. Now, I've never been very happy with this camera. The centre of it was really sharp, but the outside edges were pretty poor. Frequently I would get a lot of what looked like chromatic aberration, but I just couldn't remove it. Nothing would get rid of it. Now what I'm finding is with the latest version of Lightroom, a lot of that chromatic aberration has gone. This image in particular used to suffer from it a lot around the lower corners and edges of the frame, and also around some of the edges here. What I've found with the latest version is there isn't really any, so let's go in at 100%. So I'm not seeing any real CA fringing here. What I am seeing is that the corners are looking a little bit soft here, so let's just zoom in a little bit further, 200%. It's not too bad, whereas previously it was very, very much distorted. I want to show you the Photolab version. Immediately, there's lots more detail there. If you look at this area here of the rock on the wall, you can see that Photolab's actually revealed so much detail that it makes the Adobe version look soft. You can also see it in this bush here. We go from something that's not really acceptable to something that's sharp, and that's crazy. Now, there is something else I need to show you. Let's fit this to the screen, and in fact, I'm going to zoom out. What you may not realise is that actually the Sony takes more of a frame than you actually are seeing here. And if I take the Photolab version of this, you can actually see the edges of the frame. So if I actually move this up, what Sony has done is it's captured a lot more than you actually see when you convert it in Lightroom. And in fact, if you look at the Lightroom version, it chops it off halfway through this corner of this stick. It seems that Lightroom is making its corrections and then chopping the frame, and in doing that it seems to be wasting and stretching and losing the sharpness in the image. I don't know how Photolab's doing it, but it's definitely making a lot better job of it. I decided I've got other RAW converters as well, so let's see what they do. So if I look at Luminar 3, well, Luminar 3's done a slightly better job at keeping all the image information. So let's zoom that in again to 100%. We'll go into the corner, and although it's recovered the information, it's only slightly sharper into the corners. It also doesn't seem to have done such a severe correction of the lens distortion. Let's compare that now with PhotoRAW 2019. And there's virtually no difference between the PhotoRAW version and the Lightroom version. Let's have a look though at what the detail reveals. So let's go into 200% here. And you can see that it's starting to become a little bit soft, but not as soft as the Lightroom version. But what I would say is that the On1 version is actually performing much better if you look at the detail here in the bush. So even though it's not applying as much sharpening, it's looking better. Let's have a look at Alien Skin X4. Now, I've done two versions of this. One with the lens correction module turned on. Now, the first thing I've noticed is there's actually the red fringing that I used to get with the Lightroom version, and I'm still getting with Alien Skin. If I go into the corners, the cropping's very, very similar to the Adobe version. And in fact, although the contrast isn't as high, it is just slightly sharper than the Adobe version, but there's very little in it at all on this. And that's with the lens correction module turned on. Let's have a look at what we get with the lens correction module turned off. So immediately we recover that missing information. Now, we've still got the chromatic aberration that I mentioned earlier, but look how much sharper in the wall and this bush the image is. So what I think's happening with Alien Skin is when they're using the lens correction, like Adobe, they're stretching the image, and that's degrading the corners and edges. What I would say I've learned from this is that there's a big difference between the RAW converters, and that you would expect. What's really surprised me though is two things. One, how well Photolab's done at actually converting the image and correcting the distortion. But the second thing, which is surprised me more perhaps, is that some of the cameras that I've owned and have sold because I thought the performance was poor in the lenses, actually it's down to the software and not to the camera. I hope you found this useful. I'm Whalley. I'll see you next time for another video.